In the shadow of Mount Elgon, on the border between Kenya and Uganda, lies a beautiful but cursed land. For generations, the Sabaot people had lived on these fertile slopes of what is now known as Trans Nzoia County. But their story would become one in Kenya's darkest chapters, a painful story of land theft, political manipulation, brutal militia violence, and a military crackdown that victimized the very people it was meant to protect. At the center of it all was a young man named Wycliffe Matakwei. Trouble began long before Wycliffe Matakwei was born. In the 1920s and 1930s, British colonial rulers in Kenya forcibly removed many Sabaot families from their ancestral lands in Mount Elgon. The best farming land was given to white settlers who turned it into profitable farms. And, as expected, the Sabaot people were not happy with this arrangement. In 1932, a group of Sabaot people presented their grievances to the Kenya Land Commission, which had been set up by the British to investigate land disputes. The result of this investigation was that the British acknowledged the fact that the Sabaot people had been wronged and discussed a compensation package. The Sabaot waited and waited. 30 years went by, and soon they realized that the promised compensation was never going to come through. When Kenya gained independence from Britain in 1963, many Sabaot people hoped that their land would be returned. Instead, the new Kenyan government created new problems. In 1968, the government turned Chepkitale area, where many Sabaot people were living, into a game reserve, further reducing the area available for the expanding population. Families were forced to live with no warning, no consultation, and no compensation. They had nowhere to go. The surrounding area was forest reserve, so they couldn't settle there either. In 1971, trying to fix the problem, the government started the Chebuk Settlement Scheme. This was supposed to resettle the displaced Sabaot families into 7,700 hectares of land. But corruption infected the process from the very start. The land was supposed to come from redesignated forest areas, and the scheme was supposed to happen in phases. Phase 1 and Phase 2 went on smoothly and mostly benefited one of the Sabaot subgroups known as the Mosop clan or the Ndorobo people. Phase 3 began in 2006, and this phase was supposed to help the Soy clan, which is another subgroup of the Sabaot. However, this third phase became a disaster. The allocation process was riddled with corruption, nepotism, and political interference. Wealthy Soy leaders, who already owned large tracts of land, allegedly grabbed more plots meant for landless families. Politicians also manipulated who got land and who didn't. To make matters even worse, the government reduced the plot sizes from the originally promised amount to just 1 hectare per family. This is barely enough to survive on. The Soy clan felt cheated again. These unresolved historical land grievances contributed to ongoing land disputes in the Mount Elgon region that persisted for decades. Eventually, things would blow up. Wycliffe Kirui Matakwei was born in 1983 into this world of broken promises and land hunger. He was a young man from the Soy clan with no formal military training. But he had something powerful: a rage at historical injustice and the ability to channel it. In late 2005, as Phase 3 settlement scheme descended into chaos, Matakwei, who was by now in his 20s, and other Soy leaders decided to act. The Sabaot Land Defense Force, or the SLDF, was formed in 2005, though recruitment began in earnest in 2006. At first, the group called themselves Janjaweed, after the notorious Sudanese militia, but they later changed it to the SLDF to make it sound more legitimate. The SLDF's stated goal was simple: resist government attempts to evict squatters in the Chebuk area, and fight for the land rights for the Soy clan. But the reality was far worse. The SLDF, led by Wycliffe Matakwei himself, had a sophisticated structure for a militia group. The second in command was David Sichei, a former police officer who also trained the fighters they would recruit. Recruitment to join the SLDF started voluntarily, but soon became forced. Every Soy family was ordered to provide at least one son for training or pay a fine of 10,000 Kenyan shillings. By 2008, human rights groups estimated that the SLDF had about 3,000 fighters organized into 30 cells of roughly 100 men each. The fighters included retired security officers, children as young as 13, and even foreign mercenaries. Some estimates say that over 600 school-age children were forcefully recruited. The SLDF was unusually well armed for a Kenyan militia. They had AK-47 assault rifles, G3 rifles, machine guns, hand grenades, and rocket-propelled grenades. Most shocking of all, they wore Django camouflage uniforms, identical to those worn by the Kenya police. This made it nearly impossible for civilians to tell the difference between militia fighters and actual police officers, which was exactly the point. The weapons came from the porous borders of Uganda and Somalia, where guns were easy to buy. The uniforms likely came from corrupt security officers. Evidence suggests that local politicians funded and armed the SLDF. The militia even became a private army for politicians seeking election. In particular, they supported candidates from the Orange Democratic Movement, ODM, and they violently opposed candidates from the rival party of PNU, or Party of National Union. A key political figure said to be connected to the SLDF was Fred Kapondi, a local leader who would win a parliamentary seat in the 2007 elections. The SLDF made sure Kapondi won through terror. Starting in mid-2006, the SLDF launched a campaign of violence that would last 2 years and claim over 600 lives. This militia didn't hide in the forest like typical rebels. Most fighters lived among the civilian population in their own homes. They moved freely during the day, but their attacks came at night. Between 2006 and 2008, the SLDF took complete control of Mount Elgon region. One government official would later admit there was no government in that area. The SLDF set up a parallel administration with its own twisted version of justice. They collected what they called taxes from residents to fund their operation. Civil servants were especially targeted and had to pay or face severe consequences. The SLDF became infamous for one particular atrocity: cutting off people's ears. This was their signature punishment. If you refused to join them, if you didn't pay their taxes, if you supported the wrong politicians, if you reported them to the police, or if they simply wanted your land, they would cut off your ears. Sometimes both ears, sometimes just one, as a warning to others. They also sewed people's mouths shut if they talked too much or reported their activities. Human rights groups documented 33 people who were maimed this way, but the real number is likely much higher. Some victims were too terrified to report the crimes. The SLDF's typical operation went like this. A group of fighters, sometimes wearing police uniforms, would surround a home at night. They would break down the door, armed with all sorts of weapons, including guns. They would demand to see the man of the house. If the man had refused to join the SLDF, he would be dragged outside. His wife and children would be forced to watch as the fighters beat him, tortured him, and often cut off his ears. Many men were simply taken away. Their families never saw them again. Women left behind were beaten, raped, and sometimes killed. The SLDF explicitly warned victims not to seek medical treatment or report to the police. those who did faced death. In February 2008, police discovered mass graves in the Mount Elgon forest. These were bodies of the SLDF victims dumped in the wilderness. One witness who escaped from the SLDF torture camp described seeing corpses lying around the torture site. Rape also became a routine weapon of the SLDF. Many young men who refused to join the militia fled the area, leaving their wives alone to tend the farms. These women became easy targets. The SLDF burned homes, stole livestock, and seized land. If you owned land that an SLDF member wanted, you faced a terrible choice: give up your property or be mutilated. Many people obviously chose to surrender their land and flee. In this way, the quote-unquote Land Defense Force became exactly what they claimed to oppose: land grabbers who terrorized the innocent. Families were torn apart. Children's education was disrupted. Farming, the backbone of the local economy, collapsed. Food security became a crisis. The Mount Elgon region became known as the Mountain of Terror. By early 2008, it was estimated that 613 people were killed by the SLDF, 118 people were abducted, 33 people were maimed, that is, had their ears cut off, and 66,000 people were displaced from their homes. And as I'm sure you're wondering, where was the Kenyan government while all this was happening? Well, for the first 2 years, the Kenyan government treated the SLDF as common criminals and not an organized militia. Police units were sent in, but they failed completely. The SLDF was too well armed, too well trained, and too well politically connected. Corruption was also rampant. Some police officers were even helping this militia group. The government tried offering amnesty in 2007. They promised money to any fighter who surrendered their weapons, but not a single gun was standing. In early 2008, the SLDF attacked a police post and shot 6 police officers. 3 died and 3 others were seriously wounded with bullet wounds to their stomach, ankles, and knees. This attack was the final straw. The government realized they were dealing with an insurgency and not a criminal gang. On March 10, 2008, the Kenyan government launched Operation Okoa Maisha, or in other words, Operation Save Lives. This was a massive military operation involving 400 security personnel, 120 soldiers from the Kenyan Army, special forces from the 20th Parachute Battalion, regular infantry units, and Kenya police officers. The goal was to crush the SLDF, arrest its leaders, and restore government control to Mount Elgon. At first, residents of Mount Elgon welcomed the military intervention with open arms. They were desperate for protection from the SLDF and were very happy when the military was sent over to restore peace. Unbeknownst to them, they were welcoming a new wave of terror. When the military arrived, the SLDF fighters who had moved freely in the villages immediately retreated to the forests and caves around Mount Elgon near the Ugandan border. The army had to hunt them in dense jungle terrain where the militia had the advantage. Fighting was intense, especially at night. But what happened next was a human rights catastrophe. The army adopted a brutal strategy: round up every adult male in the area, detain them, and torture them to get information about the SLDF. Boys as young as 13 were arrested. Old men, teachers, farmers, anyone male was considered a potential SLDF member. The army set up detention camps at Kaptama and Kapkota. According to official figures, 3,200 people were detained, and of these, 2,187 were released after quote-unquote questioning, and approximately 1,100 were charged in court. But the word questioning hides a terrible truth. Detainees were subjected to horrific torture, severe beatings, electric shocks, being hung upside down, denial of food and water, and also mock executions. The torture was meant to extract information about SLDF locations and members. but many of those tortured had no connection to the militia at all. One man described being forced to watch other prisoners being tortured to death. Bodies were left lying around torture sites as warning. Women in Mount Elgon woke up one day to find their husbands, sons, brothers, and fathers simply gone, taken by the army to detention camps. Some would return, but many would not. The government claimed only 8 to 13 people were killed during this operation, but the UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions, Philip Alston, investigated and found something very different. He reported that a wide range of credible observers estimated that hundreds of men were tortured and killed by security forces. The minimum estimate was over 200 people killed or disappeared. Many bodies were never recovered. Many families to date still don't know what happened to their loved ones. Women suffered terribly during this military operation. Many were raped by soldiers, others lost their husbands and sons, and they were left widows with no support. They couldn't report these crimes because the army and the police were working together. The military operation meant to save lives had now created a new wave of terror by committing the same acts that the SLDF members had been committing in that area. Imagine calling for help, only for the helpers to unleash the same violence on you as the perpetrators. The residents of Mount Elgon suffered double tragedy. By May 2008, the SLDF was falling apart. The military offensive had been brutal but effective. The army focused on hunting down Wycliffe Matakwei, knowing that killing him would break the militia's command structure. On Friday, May 16, 2008, the army got the break they needed. Associates of Matakwei disclosed his location to authorities. He was hiding in Cheptaburbur village in Kopsiro division, not far from where the conflict had started. The army and police units tracked him down and set up an ambush. When security forces closed in, Matakwei and his bodyguards fought back. A fierce gun battle erupted. In the end, Matakwei was killed along with 12 others. A national ID found on the body confirmed it was Wycliffe Matakwei, the 24-year-old who had led this 3.5-year reign of terror. News of Matakwei's death brought different reactions. Most residents were glad that the violence might finally end, but some were doubtful. Others, like human rights groups, were furious that Matakwei was killed rather than arrested and put on trial. They wanted him to answer for his crimes in court. Matakwei's death came just 2 days after the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights released a damning report called The Mountain of Terror. The report accused the military of widespread torture, extrajudicial killings, sexual violence, and arbitrary detention. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights called for prosecution of senior military officers, including the then Defense Minister Yusuf Haji, Chief of General Staff Jeremiah Kianga, and the then commander of the Kenyan Army. The commission even asked the UN to suspend Kenya from peacekeeping missions due to the abuses. But the government denied everything, even as evidence piled up. Some wondered, was Matakwei killed in battle, or was he executed to silence him? Dead men tell no tales about who armed them, who funded them, or which politicians gave the orders. That he often froze when he took orders on his mobile phone from unseen superiors, assumed to be influential political figures. After Matakwei's death, the SLDF rapidly disintegrated. By July 2018, the fighting had substantially declined. The militia was virtually destroyed, especially around the Chebuk area. Hundreds of fighters surrendered. The army recovered 95 guns and over 700 rounds of ammunition from the SLDF. Relative peace returned to Mount Elgon, but at a terrible cost. Of the about 1,100 people charged with SLDF-related crimes, prosecutions moved slowly and many of these cases collapsed. The military officers accused of torture and extrajudicial killings were never prosecuted. The government protected them. Political leaders who funded and armed the SLDF faced no consequences. Some, like Fred Kapondi, remained in office. David Sichei, the second in command of the SLDF, was never captured. Released SLDF members tried to return to their communities, but were treated as outcasts. Some residents expressed fear at seeing people who had killed their relatives walking free. Former fighters of the SLDF also feared retribution from the community. But just as normalcy was beginning to return to the community, disturbing reports surfaced. In 2010, a herder spotted about 50 people in camouflage uniforms in the Mount Elgon forests. Some sources claimed that the SLDF was regrouping. The trauma was so deep that every rumor caused panic. People remembered what had happened before, but perhaps no one symbolized the tragedy more than Salome Matakwei, Wycliffe Matakwei's wife. After her husband's death, she became a target of the community's rage. Women blamed her for the sins of her husband and the SLDF. But in 2012, Salome Matakwei transformed from a symbol of the conflict into a peacemaker. She began working to reconcile communities and help widows affected by both the SLDF and the military operation. When the violence finally ended, the numbers were staggering. Over 800 people killed by both sides, that is the SLDF and the Operation Okoa Maisha. Tens of thousands were left traumatized, entire communities destroyed, and families torn apart forever. The sad thing was that the land issues that sparked the conflict remained unresolved. Historical injustices from colonial land theft were never remedied. Corruption in land allocation was never properly investigated. The Chebuk settlement scheme was never completed fairly, and landless families remained landless. Politicians who armed and funded the SLDF faced no consequences. They used a militia to win elections, and it worked. This sent a dangerous message that violence pays in Kenyan politics. Under the international humanitarian law, both the SLDF and the Kenyan security forces committed war crimes. Yet, no one was held accountable. While Kenya's 2007-2008 post-election violence is well documented and remembered, the Mount Elgon conflict remains largely forgotten. Wycliffe Matakwei died at 24, having led a militia for less than 4 years. In that short time, he and his fighters killed hundreds, displaced tens of thousands, and brought unimaginable suffering to Mount Elgon. Was he really a freedom fighter defending his people's land rights against historical injustices? Or was he a war criminal who used legitimate grievances as an excuse for terror? The truth is probably both. And that's what makes this story so tragic. Matakwei was a product of decades of injustice, corruption, and broken promises. But his response to that injustice created new victims, new suffering, and solved nothing. That brings us to the end of today's story. If you enjoyed our episode today, please don't forget to subscribe, to like, and to share this episode with other true crime junkies like yourself. See you right here on the next one.